Hello everyone, this is Jotto and welcome to the Hearthstone Weekly Show. Now, for this episode, I'll be going over Strifecro's Tempo Mage, although I've been calling it Machine Gun Mage, which via game may have thrown out there, and I think it's a hilarious name for Flamewaker decks. So anyway, now before we get started, just a quick thing. The tournament running tomorrow is going to be limited, and if you want any help with limited decks, I will put probably a comment with like a section there because the description gets a bit crowded sometimes. But anyway, so go and check those out if you want help with deck building. And to be honest, I think you could just run a powered down version of this deck actually if you really wanted to for limited. That being non-epics, non-legendaries. So, starting with the deck itself, we'll go over the deck card by card, sort of skipping over a couple of the really obvious ones, and then we'll go over a couple of things you can switch out if you want to. Alright, so first things first, we do have the standard Mage staples of Frostbolt for early removal, Mad Scientist with Mirror Entity, just a flat Mirror Entity line here with Mad Scientist, no third secret, mostly because the deck doesn't have space for it, so there's no counter spell or things like that, it's just playing the Mirror Entities for power. So those are pretty standard. Unstable Portal, standard in early game mages, even some late game mages. Sometimes it just wins you the game, and it usually gives you something that costs more than 2 mana, meaning it's pretty much always value. Now, besides that, standard Fireballs for late game reach, boom, because he's good, and the rest of the deck is more or less unique to this kind of structure. So, first things first, we have, for the 1-drops, Mana Worm. Now, Mana Worm is one of two and a half. Things that get more powerful based on the amount of spells you're playing. Now this is relevant because you have spare part generation in your deck and you also have a lot of small mana cost wise spells. So Mana Worm gets huge very quickly, one of the best cards you can keep in your opening hand and will completely annihilate your opponent if it is given the chance. It also encompasses what is one of the strengths of this deck, which is playing a threat, and then when your opponent doesn't have removal, they try and kill it with other minions, and you just keep removing his threats, and then the Mana Worm will get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then when your 1-drop is hitting him for 3, 4, 5 damage each turn, it adds up. The other 1-drop is a 1-up Clockwork Gnome. Now, I have seen some lists running 2. Strifecro's version was just running the 1 because it's not a fantastic card. However, you do need another 1-drop, and Clockwork Gnome is better than something like Leper Gnome, for example, because spare parts. The spare parts work for Mana Worm and Sorcerer's Apprentice, Reduced Cost, and Flamewaker and Antonidas. So anyway, onto the other minions in the deck. We do have, I already mentioned Mad Scientist, but we have Sorcerer's Apprentice. There's a lot of spells in this deck, so you can reduce every single spell in this deck, and the lower the cost of the spell, the more effective this is. So a 1-mana spell becomes 0. In the case of spare parts, that's a big deal. And you have 3 mana bulky spells becoming 2, which is much more manageable. So Sorcerer's Apprentice is a very good 2-drop. Flamewaker. Now, Flamewaker is the all-star in this kind of deck. Flamewaker is the reason why this deck has a favorable matchup against things like a Hunter, because you get a Flamewaker down, they don't kill it, you just start playing spells, wreck his board, and deal massive amounts of damage to him. Dealing 2 damage split is insane. It really does wipe boards, and it just does flat damage to your opponent when you're playing a Arcane Intellect. You draw 2, and then you just deal 4 to him because you attack with Flamewaker, and you get the trigger, or play a Mirror Image, protect your Flamewaker, and deal damage to the board. Just even Unstable Portal, things like that. It's just very, very powerful. It's the other mainstay in terms of early game spell. Just protect the threat, and then attack with it repeatedly. Flamewaker is the best early game threat to protect, along with Mana Worm, whereas the other ones are more enablers, in the case of Mad Scientist, Sorcerer's Apprentice, and Clockwork Gnome. Now, rounding out the minions, we have Mechanical Yeti. You need a 4-drop, and you're not playing Shredder, and the reason for it is because Yeti gives you spare parts. Not as good as Shredder, but it gives you spare parts, which is very relevant. Azure Drake, unique card draw, it gives you spell power, which is very relevant given that you're playing Flame Cannon, Frostball, and Fireball, which are all affected by it, and each in a very powerful way, I might add. Fireball, extra reach, Frostbolt goes to 4, which is a big deal, and Flame Cannon goes to 5, which can kill almost anything. that they can play on turn 5 or 6 even. Thorazan reduces spare parts to 0, reduces 2 cost spells to 1, and 3 costs to 2. The other thing it lets you do is reduce the cost of Archmage Antonidas, which means you can combo with him better late game if you need to. Thorazan is a very, very powerful card and is the 6-drop of choice. Now, alternatives to this would be Sylvanas or even Loatheb, but I do think Thorazan is very powerful, although I would try Loatheb if you want to, because that's a very good tempo card. Archmage Antonidas is the last minion we'll go over here, since we already mentioned Boom. Now, Archmage Antonidas is the sort of half in terms of spell synergy thing, because he comes down way late game, and this is why you have all these spare parts. You generally don't want to play spare parts unless you can enable something. In the case of Mana Worm, Archmage, or Flamewaker, unless it gives you a trade you wouldn't otherwise get, for example. But Archmage gives you the late game punch that an aggro deck needs to get back in the late game. You already have Boom, but Archmage has a bigger punch, but he's slower than Boom in terms of the amount of damage you can do to the board. You need Archmage, play some spells, next turn you can double Fireball. It's not like Boom where you can just play him and he's a big threat and then attack. You have to actually commit into Antonidas. So, on to the spells. We have Mirror Image. Now, this particular deck is not playing Sludge Belchers, and you need Mirror Image for taunts. On top of that, it's actually a 1-cost spell for Mana Worm, Sorcerer's Apprentice to make it cost 0, and Flamewaker, which is a big deal. Also quite nice with Antonidas if you draw them late game. Flame Cannon. Now, Flame Cannon is standing in as Frostbolt's copies 3 and 4. It is slightly better than Frostbolt in a couple situations, and strictly worse in most of them, but the point is, you want 4 Frostbolts, so what do? You play 2 extra Flame Cannons, and it's really nice. With Hero Power, it can go up to 5, or Spell Power, Hero Power, it can actually go up to 6, which will kill pretty much anything. So, Flame Cannon, very, very good card. Really bad against those aggro decks that swarm the board, but if you can control the board before it gets large, the card is very powerful. Now, we already talked about Frostbolt and Unstable Portal since they are staples. Arcane Intellect as a 2-of. You need the draw. It's a spell, gets reduced to 2, which makes it way less clunky by Sorcerer's Apprentice, and the draw lets you generate things for Archmage Antonidas later because you have more cards in your hand. This is a deck that works very well with a lot of cards in its hand. Well, I mean, every deck does, but the point is this works very, very well with its cards in its hands because it gives you more options to tempo your opponent out and keep attacking him. So Arcane Intellect, very nice draw spell. That pretty much rounds out the baseline deck, since the rest of the inclusions like Mirror Entity, Mad Scientist is very, very obvious in terms of Mage, and how powerful they are goes without saying. So what we're going to do is go over a couple of the cards that other versions have been playing that you might run into on ladder, or if you want to test them out yourself. First things first, Arcane Missiles. Now Arcane Missiles, from what I could tell, has been seeing play instead of Clockwork Gnome, for example, or in decks running Sludge Belcher instead of Mirror Images. Well, I mean, the Arcane Missiles will be instead of the Mirror Images because you're running Belcher, so you don't need the taunts as much. So Missiles has been very, very powerful when I have tested it out with Flamewaker. The problem is, it's not very good without Flamewaker or Mana Worm, which leaves it lacking a bit. So it's a bit better in the late game, not so much in the early game, which is weird because it costs it's only 1 mana. It also makes up for a bit of a weakness if you don't have Flamewaker against the big swarmy decks. Also looks pretty cool in the golden form, and it's a basic, so you can get it really easily. So Arcane Missiles has been seeing a rudimentary amount of play. Now, besides that, I want to go over a little bit of a... first things first, actually, if you want to run a third secret, which you may, because sometimes Scientist doesn't trigger with this deck, I have noticed, I would recommend running a counterspell. Maybe a duplicate, but I think I'd run a counterspell over duplicate. It helps protect your threats. So if you want a third secret, go for the counterspell. Now, besides that, I want to talk a little bit about a slightly different type of Tempo Mage. Now, this slightly different type has been running less focus on Flamewaker and Mana Worm, more focus on grinding your opponent out a bit. And this includes things like Water Elemental instead of Mechanical Yetis, grind your card, better against things like Warrior, for example. One of the best 4-drops you can play, so very, very strong. Flame Strike has been showing up every so often. I personally think this is unnecessary, because if you're at the point where you need Flame Strike, you're probably losing. But it is a comeback card. The problem is when you draw it, and It's early in the game, it's really bad, but if you want to try it out, go for it. Maybe it is worth the risk on the inconsistencies. Besides that, we do have things like Sludge Belcher. Now, these are the versions running a third secret, and the third secret is Duplicate. Have been running Sludge Belchers. Now, Sludge Belcher with Duplicate is a tried and tested combo that is quite frankly disgusting when you play against it. You 7 health and taunt, and then you get another one for 2 more turns, because you get 2 copies, and it's really insane if you get that combo off. Problem with Sludge Belcher, same with Flame Strike, very, very clunky when you draw them in your opening hand, whereas this build is focused more on early game consistency. If you look at the majority of the deck is 3 or less, and the rest of the upper minions are designed to boost consistency. In the case of Thorazan, reducing the more clunky cards in your hand, boom for power level, Archmage for late game, things like that, even Azure Drake just for drawing out of things. So this deck is basically designed for consistency, but if you want a bit more power, try Sludge Belcher, try Loatheb instead of Thorazan if you want to go that particular way, or as I mentioned earlier, the other alternative at 6 mana is Sylvanas. Now, Sylvanas is an incredibly powerful card and should always be tested in most decks that go up to 6 mana, just because it's that good. In this particular case, I don't think it's as good as Thorazan or Loatheb in this particular list, but if you want to test it out, by all means, go for it. Now, besides that, I did mention that you can run a second Clockwork Gnome if you really want to. If you want to go up to 4 1-drops, which is okay. I would recommend running Clockworks over Leper Gnome, whereas before Flame Waker came out, I would actually run Leper Gnomes over Clockwork Gnomes, because you only had Mana Worm and Archmage Antonidas for the spare part synergy. However, now you have a grand total of 5 cards in your deck that work off it, so I'd highly recommend playing those Clockwork Gnomes. Now, unless I've forgotten anything completely stupid, yeah, actually one last mention, which hasn't really been seen play, but something to maybe test out, is Knife Juggler if you're playing Mirror Images. Knife Juggler Mirror Image is the classic mirror image play because it just does so much damage to the board, and if you want to test out some sort of build with Knife Juggler Mirror Image, you may want to try it with Sludge Belcher and things like that as well, or maybe Duplicate, so you can get extra things to throw down. Even mirror images are not bad when you've got Knife Juggler on the board if you get them off Duplicate. So maybe try out that kind of tempo mage, but I would not try Knife Juggler in this particular style of tempo mage. But anyway, thank you all for watching. If you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any feedback, put it in the comment section below. If you want any help when it comes to deck building for Limited, I'll put my tournament report from when I won the last one about 2 weeks ago in the comment section or in the description, and I'll also put my top 5 decks in Limited thing over there. Now, lastly, I will do a Grinding the Ladder for this gameplay footage. Not sure exactly when. That should be on Saturday. So stay tuned for that if you want to see this deck in action. That should be on Saturday afternoon, most likely. But anyway, as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.